My grandfather kept his radio flyer in the garage until the day he died. Not because he used it. He hadn't pulled a child in that thing since the Eisenhower administration. He hadn't even tried, as far as I know. The grandchildren grew up too fast. The way children always do when you're paying attention to something else. And then suddenly, they were teenagers who wanted car keys, not wagon rides. But he kept it anyway. Oiled the axle twice a year. Touched up the red paint with a small brush and a can he ordered directly from the company in Chicago. Wiped down the wooden handle with linseed oil on the last Sunday of every October. Before the garage went cold for winter. When I asked him once why he bothered, he looked at me the way old men look at young people who've missed something obvious and unforgivable. Some things, he said, you just don't throw away. I've been thinking about that wagon for 30 years. About what it meant, what it really meant. That a man who grew up hungry in the Depression, who buried 2 brothers in the Pacific, who built a life from nothing in a country that owed him exactly nothing, would spend his Sunday afternoons keeping a children's toy in perfect condition. I think I finally understand it. And understanding it turns out to be the key to one of the most remarkable survival stories in American manufacturing history. A story about stubbornness and genius and terrible mistakes and, ultimately, about knowing what you're actually selling, which is almost never what you think you're selling. Boy from Venice who smelled like sawdust to you. That probably never heard of Antonio Payson. Most Americans haven't, which is a shame. Because his story is as purely American as any story gets. And he wasn't even born here. He came into the world in 1897 in Venice, Italy. Not the tourist Venice of gondolas and honeymoon photographs and sunset aperitivos. The other Venice, the working one, where salt air mixed with sawdust and families stacked themselves forward to a room above someone else's shop, and the faded beauty of the place was cold comfort when you were trying to eat. His father was a cabinet maker. Not the refined kind who made ornate furniture for wealthy households and signed his work. The practical kind, the kind who built market carts, storage chests, workshop benches, anything that needed to be sturdy and functional and finished by Friday. The kind who never expected applause, only payment. Antonio learned 2 things from that workshop before he was old enough to shave. That materials have a nature. You either respect or fight. And that fighting them is always the slower path. He also learned that good work needed no apology. You made the thing correctly, and the thing spoke for itself. That was the entire philosophy. He would hold on to it for the rest of his life, sometimes brilliantly, sometimes to his cost. He was 11 when his formal schooling ended, not because he lacked aptitude, but because his father needed another pair of hands. The Payson family couldn't afford the luxury of education for its own sake. What Antonio got instead was something most engineers spend years trying to acquire: an intuitive understanding of the relationship between materials and force, between design and durability, between what looks good on paper and what holds up under actual weight and actual weather on actual streets. Venice in the early 1900s was beautiful and dying economically. Tourism kept the city alive, barely. Opportunities for working-class families contracted every year. Antonio's older brother had already left for Milan. His sister had married a merchant sailor and moved to Genoa. The family was fragmenting the way families do when the place they come from stops being able to hold them. In 1913, at 16, Antonio made the decision that would define the next 7 decades of his life. The Italian economy was stagnating. Venice was gorgeous and going nowhere. America, specifically Chicago, was where his mother's cousin had opened a small grocery and wrote letters home describing a city that rebuilt itself after fires, where ambition counted for more than ancestry, where a man who worked hard and refused to quit could build something real. He sailed third class on a steamship, 19 days across the Atlantic. He arrived at Ellis Island with $27 sewn into the lining of his jacket, a small toolkit his father had pressed into his hands at the dock, and functional English learned from a phrase book during the crossing. He'd studied it every evening in the ship's cramped hold, mouthing words quietly so as not to wake the men sleeping around him. Thought the immigration officer at Ellis Island misspelled his name in the ledger. Payson became something close enough. Antonio never corrected it. He told his grandson years later that leaving the old spelling behind felt like leaving the old world behind, like the name that crossed the ocean wasn't quite the same person as the one who arrived. He was right about that in ways he probably didn't fully realize yet. Chicago. 1914. The education nobody gave him. Chicago was not what the cousins' letters had suggested. The city was loud and indifferent and bitterly cold in ways Venice had never prepared him for. Lake Michigan in January creates a particular kind of cold, the kind that finds gaps in your coat and settles into your joints and makes you genuinely uncertain whether you've made a terrible mistake. Antonio found work in an upholstery factory. 10-hour shifts in a building with no ventilation, where fabric dust hung in the air so thick you could taste it on your teeth. $11 a week. A boarding house room he shared with 2 other Italian immigrants, one from Naples, one from Calabria, sleeping in rotation on 2 narrow beds. He was 17 years old and approximately 8,000 miles from anyone who'd known him before he was. But here is the thing about Antonio Payson that would define everything that followed. The quality that was simultaneously his greatest strength and the thing that would eventually require his grandson to save the company he built. He could not stop noticing how things could be done better. While other workers at the upholstery factory punched their clocks and went home exhausted and thought about nothing except getting through the week, Antonio noticed that the factory was losing hours to badly cut wooden frames. Pre-cut pieces arrived from the supplier slightly off measurement, not by much, maybe a 1/4 inch here, a 1/2 inch there, but enough that workers spent significant time correcting them before they could be assembled. It was waste, pure and visible, and it offended something deep in Antonio's nature. He sketched improvements in a notebook he kept beside his narrow bed. He borrowed technical drawing books from the Chicago Public Library on his days off and taught himself the language of engineering diagrams. He befriended a German machinist named Wilhelm who ate lunch alone and was delighted to find someone who wanted to talk about gear, ratios, and mechanical advantage over bad coffee. Antonio was building an education without a classroom, without a teacher, without a credential, without any guarantee it would ever amount to anything. That was, and would remain, entirely his way of doing things. By 1917, after 3 years of bread and soup 6 days a week, of sending money back to Venice when he could spare it, of living small and working hard and refusing every distraction, he had saved $800. He rented a small workshop on the north side of Chicago, 600 square feet, 2nd floor above a hardware store, and began making wagons. Not children's toys. Not yet, work wagons. Heavy-duty wooden carts that vegetable vendors could haul through Chicago's rutted, frost-heaved streets without losing a wheel or their cargo. Carts that could handle a Chicago winter and a Chicago summer, and the kind of weight that actual working people needed to move. The timing was, in retrospect, accidentally perfect. America had entered the Great War. Metal was being redirected to the military effort, and wooden carts were suddenly scarcer than they'd been in 2 decades. He called the company the Liberty Coaster Company. The name announced his patriotism and his product in 4 words. Very Antonio. The first year, he built 12 wagons. By hand. Every joint fitted himself. Every wheel balanced himself. Every coat of varnish applied with a brush, and the patience of a man who had no other plan than this one. It was not fast. It was not immediately profitable in any meaningful way. But those 12 wagons did not break. When customers returned, they came back to order more wagons, not to complain about the ones they bought. That was the foundation. Not clever pricing or savvy distribution or good timing, though timing played its part. Wagons that simply did not break, made by a man who considered breaking a kind of failure he wasn't willing to live with. Anna and the pivot that changed everything in 1920. Antonio married Anna Petrangelo, whose family had come from the same region of Italy and who brought to the marriage a savings of $340. She'd accumulated over 4 years of seamstress work, a sum that, combined with what Antonio had, allowed him to hire his first employee, a young Polish immigrant with carpentry experience named Joseph, who showed up on time every day and never complained about the hours thought by 1923. Liberty Coaster was producing 40 wagons a week and employing 6 workers. And Antonio was about to make the pivot that would define the next 80 years of the company, not because he saw it coming, but because his wife did. Anna had been watching the neighborhood children. Specifically, she'd been watching them climb into the commercial work carts, the adult wagons, the heavy-duty utility carts, and ride them with expressions of absolute, uncomplicated joy. Not because anyone had told them this was fun. Not because the wagon had been designed for them, but because a wagon is, at some essential level, a machine for experiencing motion and independence. And children understand that instinctively, even when adults have forgotten it. She told Antonio, "There's a market here." He listened. The children's wagon market in the early 1920s was fragmented and almost entirely local, small craftsmen and tiny workshops making whatever their regional market would absorb. Quality varying wildly, no national brand, no consistent product. Antonio saw what most woodworkers in his position would have missed. Standardization could create consistency, and consistency could create reputation. And reputation was the only kind of competitive advantage that compounded over time without requiring you to constantly spend money defending it. But wooden wagons had a ceiling, and Antonio understood it. They were heavy. A typical children's wooden wagon weighed 35 pounds empty. They splintered with use. They swelled in humid summer weather and cracked in the dry cold of Chicago winters. They required maintenance. They had taken him as far as wood could take anyone. He began looking at metal wagons at trade shows. Stamped steel bodies, formed under enormous pressure, lighter and more durable than wood, manufacturable at scale in ways no woodworking operation could match. The problem was the stamping press. It cost $12,000. Antonio had not earned $12,000 in total since stepping off that boat from Venice. He borrowed the down payment anyway. This is, I think, the moment that separates the people who build lasting things from the people who don't. Not the vision. Plenty of people have vision. Not even the willingness to risk everything, though that matters. It's the willingness to risk everything on something you haven't fully figured out yet. Knowing the figuring out will have to happen under pressure, in real time. With money you don't have to lose. The 6 months that nearly broke him for 6 months after that stamping press arrived at the workshop. The company generated 0 revenue. Antonio was trying to master a process he had never attempted. On equipment he could barely afford, with skills he was developing in real time. Too much pressure from the press and the steel tore along the stamping lines. Too little, and the body panels came out soft, unable to hold their shape under load. The metal gauge had to be precisely calibrated, heavy enough to provide structural integrity, light enough that a child's parent could actually lift the thing. He slept 4 hours a night during those 6 months. He arrived at the workshop before dawn. He adjusted and failed and adjusted again, which is to say he worked exactly the way he had always worked. with the specific kind of stubbornness that looks, from the outside, like either genius or madness, depending entirely on whether it ultimately works. It worked. The result was the radio flyer, named for radio, the dominant technology of 1927. The thing that had recently made it possible to hear a human voice transmitted through the air, which still felt miraculous to people who remembered silence and flyer, because the wagon suggested speed, freedom, the particular stomach-hollowing joy of rolling downhill with nothing but momentum between you and wherever you were going. Stamped steel body. Red paint, chosen not for romance but because it was the cheapest and most durable color available, which is the kind of detail that tells you everything about the man who made the decision. Wooden handle. 4 rubber wheels. Retail price, $4.95. The first production run of 1,000. Units sold out in 7 weeks. Retailers reordered before Antonio had finished processing the initial orders. The World's Fair and the 45-foot wagon. Century of Progress Exposition opened in Chicago in 1933. 22 million people came through those gates over the course of the fair. 22 million people, during the deepest year of the Great Depression, who scraped together the admission price, and it wasn't cheap. Not in 1933, to see what the future might hold. They came because the present was so relentlessly grim that even a glimpse of what might be coming felt worth the cost of a ticket. Antonio, pacing, could not afford a standard exhibition booth. The fees were beyond what the company had available in liquid cash. So he built a 45-foot wooden replica of a radio flyer wagon and parked it outside the main entrance of the fairgrounds, where every single one of those 22 million visitors would have to walk directly past it. The structure cost $2,800 to build, nearly 10% of the company's liquid assets at the time, a staggering sum for a manufacturer still finding its footing. It was enormous and red and impossible to overlook, and, in retrospect, it was the greatest piece of guerrilla marketing in the history of American toy manufacturing, executed by a man who had never taken a single marketing course and probably would have been contemptuous of the concept if someone had tried to explain it to him. Radio Flyer took orders for more than 15,000 wagons in 6 months. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. 15,000 wagons. From a company that had started 16 years earlier by building 12. That is not growth. That is transformation. The metal wagon had not simply improved on the wooden wagon. It had made the wooden wagon obsolete, and in doing so, it had created a category that Radio Flyer would own, almost without competition, for the next 4 decades. The Depression, and why it didn't kill him. The Depression should have killed Radio Flyer the way it killed most American manufacturers. Between 1929 and 1933, toy sales in the United States collapsed 60%. Families who'd been comfortable were suddenly choosing between food and rent. Credit dried up. Retailers went bankrupt in waves. Children who'd expected toys for Christmas got oranges, if they were lucky, and understood without being told that asking for more was not appropriate. Antonio cut his workforce from 17 to 9 in the worst months of 1930. That part of the story is not exceptional. Every surviving manufacturer did something similar. What was exceptional was what he did next, while competitors slashed prices and cut corners, and prayed that the economy would recover before they ran out of reserves. Antonio quietly kept adding features. In 1934, he engineered a controlled turning mechanism, a device that prevented the front wheels from jackknifing too sharply during a tight turn, which prevented the wagon from tipping over when a child leaned into a corner at speed. It added 18 cents to production costs. His accountant argued against it for 3 weeks with the kind of passion that accountants reserve for occasions. when they are absolutely certain they are right. Antonio implemented it anyway, and his reasoning reveals something important about how he thought. He wasn't adding the feature because it was nice to have. He was adding it because it was a piece of permanent advertising. Every wagon that didn't tip was a wagon whose owner told 3 neighbors. Every wagon that held together for 10 years and got handed from one child to the next was a wagon that made its quality case without Antonio spending a cent on marketing. In an economy where every dollar was rationed and every purchase scrutinized, the reputation of being the product that didn't require replacing was worth more than any price reduction he could have offered. He also refused, during the darkest months of 1932, to lay off his skilled workers. He cut shifts instead, 3 days a week rather than 6, half wages rather than none. It drained his cash reserves to a level that should have terrified him. It delayed equipment upgrades by years. It was, by any conventional manufacturing logic, the wrong decision. But when the economy began its slow climb back from the bottom in 1934, Radio Flyer could ramp production immediately. His competitors spent months trying to find, hire, and retrain workers they'd let go. That lag cost them orders they never recovered. By 1935, Radio Flyer was producing 3,000 wagons per day and employing more than 200 workers. The Depression, which destroyed most of the competition, had made Radio Flyer into exactly what Antonio had been trying to build since that first year in the 600-square-foot workshop, the dominant company in its category. The war, the jerry cans, and the day he started planning for Peace December 1941 changed everything, as it changed everything for everyone. Within weeks of Pearl Harbor, the federal government restricted civilian use of steel, the material Antonio had built his company around, the material that made the Radio Flyer superior to every wooden wagon ever made, was suddenly a controlled substance, redirected entirely to the war effort. The factory that had been stamping out 50,000 wagons a month went silent. Antonio converted the facility to war production within 60 days. The stamping equipment that formed wagon bodies could, with modification, produce the bodies of 5-gallon military fuel cans, the standard jerry cans that American forces would use throughout the war to keep machinery moving across 3 continents. The painting facility could apply military-spec coatings. The quality control protocols Antonio had developed for wagons turned out to be, with some adjustment, essentially what the military required for any fabricated metal. Product. Radio Flyer produced more than 700,000 fuel cans between 1942 and 1945. The work kept the factory running and the workforce employed and generated enough profit to fund equipment modernization that peacetime revenue never quite justified. But Antonio was 55 years old and spending his days making military supplies instead of the product that had defined his entire adult life. By any account, this should have felt like a detour. To the people around him, watching him work, it looked like something else entirely, like a man who had accepted a temporary role and was keeping very careful track of when it would end. The day Germany surrendered in Europe, Antonio began planning the return to civilian production. Not on the day Japan surrendered, not when steel restrictions were officially lifted. The day Germany surrendered, months before any of that happened. He used war production profits to purchase new stamping equipment and expand the factory by 20,000 square feet. While other manufacturers waited cautiously to see how peacetime consumer markets would develop, whether the pent-up demand was real, whether the money was there, whether the baby boom the veterans were apparently creating in remarkable quantities would actually produce the purchasing households everyone was predicting. Antonio prepared for what he considered inevitable: a massive surge in demand for everything that a generation of Americans had been deferring for 4 years. Radio Flyer was among the first toy manufacturers to resume full production after the war's end. By Christmas of 1945, the company had stamped out 35,000 wagons. They sold out in 6 weeks. The baby boom had begun. Antonio Payson had positioned himself to catch it. The golden years, when a wagon was just something you had if you grew up in America between 1945 and 1970. You don't need me to explain what came next. You lived it. Wide sidewalks and new subdivisions where the concrete was still pale and uncracked. Summer afternoons that stretched until the streetlights came on and someone's mother called from a front porch. The particular physics of a wagon on a hill. The way you had to lean back and drag one heel against the asphalt to moderate your speed. The way your stomach dropped pleasantly at the crest before momentum took over completely. The way you could fit 3 kids in one wagon if 2 of them were willing to hang their legs over the sides. And nobody told a parent. By 1950, Radio Flyer controlled 60% of the American wagon market. By 1957, the West Grand Avenue factory was running 3 shifts, around the clock, and producing 22,000 wagons per day. To put that in a context that might mean something, that's more wagons per day than Ford produced cars at the River Rouge plant, which was, at the time, the largest integrated manufacturing facility in the world. The wagon appeared in Norman Rockwell paintings. It appeared in Life magazine photo essays about what post-war American family life was supposed to look like. It appeared in advertisements for products that had nothing to do with wagons, soap, insurance, canned goods. Breakfast cereal, used as visual shorthand for wholesome American childhood in exactly the way a picket fence or a golden retriever would be used. Because everyone understood what it meant without needing it explained. The typical American garage in 1955 had a Radio Flyer in it the way it had a lawnmower and a bag of grass seed, and a jar of assorted screws that nobody remembered purchasing. You just had one. It was assumed infrastructure, like a baseball glove or a bicycle. The equipment of a childhood that the culture had decided was the correct childhood to be having. What's remarkable, looking back at those years from this distance, is how little the core product changed. Antonio believed the design had reached its final form in 1933, and that's significant. Alteration would dilute the brand rather than improve it. When engineers proposed replacing the wooden handle with stamped metal in 1959, which would have cut production costs by 11%, a meaningful number at that volume, he refused without extended deliberation. Customers expected wood. The feel of a worn wooden handle, warm from a summer afternoon, slightly rough in the places where 1,000 small hands had gripped it. That texture was part of what people were paying for. Whether they articulated it that way or not, he was right about the handle. He was, in a way that would only become clear later, also building the terms of a trap. Success sustained for long enough begins to look like the natural order of things. The people inside a company that has dominated its market for 20 years stop asking whether the market will always be there. They start asking how to make the operation more efficient, how to expand distribution, how to squeeze another percentage point of margin from the supply chain. The existential questions stop feeling worth asking. The existential questions are always worth asking. The enemy nobody saw coming. The warning signs appeared in the late 1960s, and they were easy to dismiss. Which is exactly why they were dangerous. Plastic wagons started appearing at discount retailers. Cheaper by half, $8.99 compared to Radio Flyer's $24.99. Lighter, easier to manufacture, coming in colors beyond the classic red. Antonio Payson, who was in his 70s and had spent 50 years watching inferior products fail against his superior ones, was not alarmed. He was, by his own account, mildly contemptuous. He was also, on the narrow question of comparative product quality, Entirely correct. A radio flyer steel wagon could carry 200 pounds without flexing. Plastic wagons cracked at 75. A radio flyer could be handed from one child to the next for a generation, accumulating the particular beauty of a well-used thing. Plastic wagons faded in sunlight, brittled in cold weather, and began falling apart within 2 years. The superiority was not a matter of opinion. It was measurable, testable, consistent. Why Antonio missed what his son Mario, who inherited the company's day-to-day management as Antonio aged, struggled to fully understand was that product superiority is only a competitive advantage if customers are optimizing for the thing you're superior at. American families in 1970 were not making the same calculation as American families in 1950. The average family in 1970 moved every 5 years, up from every 12 in 1950. When you move that frequently, you don't hand wagons down through generations, because you're not living near the generations you'd hand them to. Durability becomes less valuable when continuity is gone. A product that lasts 20 years is only worth its premium price if you're planning to be somewhere to use it for 20 years. Meanwhile, television was transforming the toy industry in ways that Radio Flyer, which had never advertised on television and didn't intend to, was slow to grasp. Companies like Mattel and Hasbro were creating product desire through Saturday morning commercials, turning children into active participants in their own consumer education, teaching them to ask for specific things by name in ways that put enormous pressure on parents. The toy category was becoming aspirational, trend-driven, seasonal in ways that a durable metal wagon with an 80-year design lineage was fundamentally not equipped to accommodate. Radio Flyer's market share began declining. Slowly at first, 60% in 1965, 55% in 1970, then faster. By 1975, it was at 48%. The company was still large, still profitable, still producing millions of units annually. But the trajectory had reversed for the first time in company history, and reversals, once established, have a way of continuing. The research Mario commissioned in 1975, the company's first formal market study, delivered findings that were sobering, not because they were surprising, but because they confirmed what thoughtful people inside the company already suspected and nobody particularly wanted to say out loud. Parents who'd grown up with Radio Flyer wagons in the 1940s and 50s valued the brand and were willing to pay premium prices for a product they associated with their own childhoods. Parents who'd grown up in the 1960s had less brand loyalty, less specific wagon memory, and more price sensitivity. As the customer base shifted generationally, the emotional advantage that Radio Flyer had counted on, the nostalgia, the heritage, the sense that this particular wagon was the one that real American childhoods were made of, was diminishing. Not because the quality had declined, but because fewer and fewer potential customers had the formative experience that made the quality feel worth paying for. Antonio Payson died in 1990 at 93. He had run Radio Flyer for 73 years and overseen the production of more than 70 million wagons. His funeral was attended by more than 800 people, including workers who had been with the company for 4 decades. He died believing, with the same cold certainty he'd brought to every major decision of his life, that quality and reputation would always ultimately triumph over price and convenience. He was not entirely wrong, but he did not live to see how complicated the question would become. The collapse, and the numbers that tell it. Mario Payson inherited Radio Flyer just as several forces that had been building for years converged into something that could no longer be managed. By doing what had always worked, the 1990s brought prosperity to most of America. To Radio Flyer, they brought crisis. Between 1990 and 2000, The company's revenue declined by 40%. Market share dropped from 35% to 28%. The workforce at the Chicago factory shrank from 1,200 employees to 450. For the first time in company history, Radio Flyer posted annual losses: $1.2 million in 1998, $2.8 million in 1999. But the numbers, bad as they were, told only part of the story. The part that was harder to put in a spreadsheet was this: American childhood itself had changed. Structurally, not temporarily, not as a trend that proper marketing could reverse, but as a fundamental reorganization of how children in this country spent their time and where they spent it. In 1970, 40% of American children walked or biked to school. By 2000, 13%. In 1981, children between the ages of 6 and 8 spent an average of 2 hours a day in unstructured outdoor play. By 1997, 30 minutes. The backyard, Radio Flyer's natural habitat. The setting for every advertisement the company had ever run. The terrain that gave the wagon its entire reason for existing was becoming a decorative space rather than a world. Children actually inhabited. Parenting. Culture had transformed in ways that were both understandable and, from Radio Flyer's perspective, devastating. The free-ranging childhood of the post-war decades, the kind where children left the house after breakfast and returned for dinner and nobody in between, knew precisely where they were, had given way to supervised playdates, organized activities, carefully scheduled afternoons. Whether the old neighborhoods were actually less safe than parents perceived, the perception was what drove behavior. Children were increasingly indoors in controlled environments, engaged with entertainment that was more immediately stimulating and more weather-independent than pulling a wagon down the block. And then there was the screen, television, video games, eventually the internet. Entertainment that arrived in your living room without requiring you to go anywhere. That didn't depend on weather or neighborhood geography or finding a hill at the right grade. That didn't require another child to join you. Each year, the competition for the hours that might have been spent with a wagon became more sophisticated and more compelling. Mario Payson understood that something was wrong. He tried nostalgia campaigns, ads showing grandparents and grandchildren with the same wagon, emotional appeals to heritage and generational connection. Beautifully produced work that won advertising awards and did not move product. He tried diversification, tricycles, scooters, ride-on toys, the very strategy his father had rejected for 70 years. Entering crowded categories where Radio Flyer had no particular advantage and no established retail relationships. He tried holding on American manufacturing while matching Chinese prices, which is economically impossible but feels, from inside a company with a century of domestic production history, like the only honorable choice. None of it worked, because none of it addressed the actual problem, which was that the world Radio Flyer had been built to serve was no longer the world that existed. By 2001, annual losses exceeded $3 million. The company's credit line was maxed. Suppliers demanded cash on delivery rather than extending terms. There were quiet conversations among board members about bankruptcy filings and acquisition approaches from private equity firms who wanted the brand and had no particular interest in the Chicago factory or its workers. The grandson's diagnosis: Robert Payson, Antonio's grandson, joined the company in 2002. He was 31 years old, educated in product design at Notre Dame, seasoned by 5 years designing car interiors at Honda. He returned to Chicago to find a company that was, in his own later description, 80 months from insolvency. He did what you do when you want to understand something clearly. He ignored the mythology and, looked at the numbers. What he found was a company trapped between two identities that could not coexist. Radio Flyer was simultaneously trying to be a premium heritage brand, the authentic, American-made, heirloom quality wagon that real childhood memories were made of, and a mass-market toy manufacturer competing for shelf space at Walmart against Chinese imports that cost a third as much to produce. The result was products that were too expensive for price-sensitive buyers and not differentiated enough to command genuine premium prices from anyone else. The financial specifics were worse than the family had acknowledged publicly. The classic steel wagon, Antonio's original, the product whose image was on the letterhead, the thing the company's entire identity was built around, was being sold at a loss. Manufacturing cost, $31.50. Wholesale price, $29. The iconic product, the one that defined the brand, was subsidized by the thin margins of everything else. Robert examined 43 different products in the company's line and found that only 7 were profitable when fully accounting for overhead and inventory carrying costs. He spent 3 months analyzing the situation with the specific kind of detachment that's available to someone who loves the company but didn't grow up inside it. He studied luxury brands in other categories. He studied what Restoration Hardware had done to furniture, what Williams-Sonoma had done to kitchen equipment, how they had successfully reframed commodity purchases as identity purchases, taken products that people thought of as functional objects and transformed them into expressions of who the buyer wanted to be. He built financial models that asked the question everyone inside Radio Flyer was afraid to ask directly. What if we stopped trying to be everything to everyone and became something specific to someone? His conclusion was simple and alarming. Radio Flyer could not compete in the mass-market toy category. Chinese manufacturers had a cost advantage measured not in percentages, but in multiples. A Chinese factory worker in 1995 earned roughly 1/20th of what an American factory worker earned. And no efficiency program, no automation investment, no supply chain optimization could close a gap that large. The company had been trying to close it for a decade and had nearly bankrupted itself in the attempt. But there was another path, a path that involved accepting a smaller company, a smaller market, lower unit volumes, and building something sustainable within those constraints, rather than continuing to chase a mass-market position that was gone and was not coming back. The plan that seemed like madness in March 2006. With the company approximately 6 months from NC, Robert presented his strategy to the board. Triple the price of the classic wagon. Cut 60% of the product line immediately with no phase-out period. Exit Walmart and Target entirely. Move high-volume plastic products to Chinese contract manufacturers. Refocus the Chicago factory exclusively on premium steel wagons and specialty items. Reposition Radio Flyer not as a mass-market toy manufacturer, but as a heritage brand selling not a product exactly, but a piece of American childhood made physical. The basic steel wagon would retail for $89.99, up from $29, a 300% increase. Announced during the worst sales crisis in company history. The board argued for months. Every instinct built from 90 years of mass-market manufacturing said this was wrong, that raising prices during a sales slump was the kind of decision that ends companies, that abandoning the democratic promise of quality at accessible prices betrayed everything Antonio Payson had stood for. Mario Payson, Robert's father, abstained from the final vote. He later said he couldn't choose between his son's vision and his father's legacy, that both felt like obligations he couldn't rank. The vote passed 4-3. Robert's counterargument to the board had been simple and brutal. Volume was already dead. Radio Flyer was selling 2 million units annually at a loss. Selling 1 million units profitably was better by any measure that actually mattered. And the customers who would pay $89.99 for a wagon were a fundamentally different population than the customers buying $24.99 plastic wagons at Walmart. Radio Flyer couldn't compete for the Walmart customer. That battle was lost and had been lost for years. But it could own the customer who wanted authenticity, craftsmanship, the particular satisfaction of buying something built to last in a world that increasingly wasn't. He cited case studies from other industries where companies had made similar transitions. Kitchen equipment repositioned as lifestyle objects. Furniture repositioned as design statements. Clothing repositioned as craft rather than commodity. In each case, the company that survived was the one that stopped trying to serve everyone and started serving a specific someone very well. The critical insight. The one that sounds obvious now and was anything but obvious in 2005. Was this? Radio Flyer's actual competitive advantage wasn't manufacturing efficiency or distribution reach. It was heritage and emotional resonance. The wagon meant something to a certain kind of customer in a way that no Chinese-manufactured plastic toy could replicate. Because meaning isn't manufactured, it accumulates. A century of accumulated meaning is not an asset you can duplicate. It is, however, an asset you can price correctly or incorrectly, and Radio Flyer had been pricing it incorrectly for decades. The execution, the repositioning, was comprehensive and, by the standards of the toy industry, essentially without precedent. Radio Flyer cut from 43 products to 18 in a single move. Unprofitable lines were discontinued immediately, not phased out gracefully, not cleared through discount channels with extended timelines, but stopped. The inventory was liquidated at cost or below to generate immediate cash for operations. Manufacturing was restructured. High-volume plastic products moved to Chinese contract facilities where Radio Flyer controlled quality specifications but didn't own the factories. The Chicago facility focused exclusively on steel wagons and specialty items. The products were American manufacturing, added to the brand story rather than simply to the cost. Structure. The workforce was reduced to 280 employees, the smallest the company had been since 1938. This was accomplished through buyout packages for workers over 55 and early retirement incentives without mass layoffs. Robert understood that how you treat people on the way down determines what kind of company you are on the way up. And he wanted the workers who remained to feel like participants in the new strategy rather than survivors of the old one. Classic. Steel wagons were repriced at levels the market had never seen from Radio Flyer. The basic model at $89.99. Deluxe versions with wooden sides at $129.99. Specialty models approaching $200. This represented price increases of 250 to 400%, enacted all at once. Then Radio Flyer did something the toy industry genuinely did not have a category for. It started marketing wagons to adults who didn't have children. Robert had identified a customer segment nobody else had bothered to see. Affluent adults, roughly 35 to 55 years old, who had grown up with Radio Flyer wagons and carried some specific piece of that experience: the weight of the handle, the sound of rubber wheels on concrete, the particular red that was somehow the exact red that summer afternoons used to be, as a kind of personal artifact. These people weren't in the market for a toy. They were in the market for a memory made solid. Radio Flyer introduced limited edition models targeting this customer directly. A 1930s replica with wooden sides and period-correct wheel hubs, $179.99. A Liberty edition with vintage graphics commemorating the company's founding, $149.99. A Centennial edition with brass fittings and hand-finished wood, $299.99. These products were positioned not as toys, but as collectibles, design objects. Nostalgia made physical and permanent. The company partnered with Restoration Hardware to place wagons in home decor stores, beside heirloom quality furniture and artisan ceramics, where the wagon's visual language read simple, unmistakable, read as design object rather than toy. They placed products in Williams-Sonoma's garden catalog, alongside cast-iron planters and heirloom tomato seedling kits. They pitched Pottery Barn on wagons as outdoor accessories and photo props for the aspirational family lifestyle that their customers were constructing. The retail strategy was deliberately counterintuitive. Radio Flyer exited mass-market retailers entirely for its premium line. The chains that had been its primary distribution channel for decades, the Walmarts and Targets that demanded low prices, high volumes, and margins thin enough to qualify as polite fictions, were replaced by specialty retailers and high-end catalogs where premium pricing was expected and heritage added to the product's appeal rather than creating cognitive dissonance. The advertising changed completely. Radio Flyer ran campaigns that didn't show children playing. They showed empty wagons in beautifully composed settings, on the front porch of a restored craftsman bungalow, in a garden between rows of heirloom vegetables, at a beach house with weathered shingles and late afternoon light. The tagline was 5 words. Everyone remembers their first Radio Flyer. The ads weren't selling toys. They were selling a specific kind of identity, belonging to the kind of American family that valued made things, lasting things, things with history. It was, in its way, a very Antonio move. Sell what the product actually represents, not just what it does. What happened when the numbers came in? The first year's results were alarming by one measure and revelatory by every other. Unit sales dropped 35%. Revenue increased 12%. A plastic wagon sold at $29 generated a margin of approximately $3. A premium steel wagon sold at $89.99 generated approximately $38. The mathematics were simple and had been available for years to anyone willing to look at them honestly. Selling fewer wagons at honest prices generated more actual money than selling many wagons at prices that didn't cover the cost of making them. The entire apparatus of the previous decade, the volume targets, the market share metrics, the production output numbers that everyone inside the company tracked as proxies for health, had been measuring the wrong things. But something else happened. Something that the financial models hadn't captured, and that turned out to matter as much as the margin improvement. The customers who bought the premium wagons talked about them. Not in the way that satisfied. Customers mentioned products to neighbors. They posted photographs on the early social media platforms, Flickr, then Facebook, not to review a toy, but to narrate a reunion with a piece of themselves. They wrote blog posts about what the wagon had triggered, specific summer afternoons, specific grandparents, specific smells and sounds that had been dormant for decades and were suddenly, inexplicably, right there. They included Radio Flyer wagons in the home design boards they were creating on Pinterest, alongside refurbished furniture and vintage kitchen equipment, and all the other physical objects through which a certain demographic was constructing a vision of the life it wanted. Radio Flyer had not just found a new price point. It had found a new function. The wagon was no longer primarily a vehicle for children. It was a vehicle for adults, a mechanism for touching something that felt real and lasting, in a world that increasingly felt temporary and disposable. The third generation takes the wheel. Robert Payson became CEO in 2008, completing the transition to the third generation of family leadership. He inherited a company that had stabilized but still faced a fundamental question. How do you build a sustainable future for a product whose cultural moment has passed? His answer was to keep extending the core insight. Radio Flyer wasn't selling wagons. It was selling a specific experience of nostalgia and Americana, an idealized childhood that was, for a particular kind of customer, worth paying genuinely for. The product strategy that followed was built entirely around that. Understanding Radio Flyer introduced adult-size wagons engineered for gardening and outdoor entertaining, heavy-duty models with pneumatic tires and telescoping handles capable of hauling 150 pounds of mulch or soil. These appeared in garden catalogs alongside $400 outdoor furniture, positioned not as toys but as tools for the kind of engaged, hands-in-the-dirt weekend life that the same customers buying the premium wagons were also constructing. The all-terrain cargo wagon, at $149.99, became a consistent bestseller in a category that hadn't existed. 5 years earlier, they launched the rental program for weddings and special events, Flower Girls. Arriving in a Radio Flyer wagon became a trend that appeared in bridal magazines and then spread through the wedding industry with the specific velocity of things that photograph beautifully. Radio Flyer didn't just sell the wagons to wedding venues. It created a recurring revenue stream from rentals, extracting commercial value from the product's symbolic power rather than just its physical utility. They created custom corporate wagons as executive gifts and promotional items. Google ordered 500 custom-branded wagons for a company event at $180 per unit, a $90,000 order that generated more profit than 10,000 mass-market wagons would have. The wagon, which had once been priced to be accessible to every working American family, had become a luxury corporate gift item. Antonio would have had thoughts about that. Those thoughts would probably have been complicated. The company also recognized something that the cultural shift of the 1990s had produced as an unintended byproduct. While unstructured outdoor play had declined across most demographics, it had become a marker of a specific kind of affluent progressive parenting. Parents who limited screen time, who bought organic produce and wooden toys, who read parenting books about the importance of free-range childhood, and worried about the developmental effects of too much structured activity. These parents were purchasing a vision of childhood as much as specific products. They were, in their own way, buying nostalgia, a childhood that resembled the one their grandparents had described, updated for an era of better sun protection and more considered gender dynamics. Radio Flyer positioned itself as the wagon for the childhood. These parents were trying to give their children not the childhood that was statistically common, but the childhood that represented the right values. The advertising showed diverse families in beautiful outdoor settings, beach houses, urban gardens, rambling farms, with wagons as natural components of an idealized life. The wagon appeared in restoration hardware and pottery, barn catalogs, alongside $80 children's rain boots and $200 wooden play kitchens. This worked because it was backed by genuine, testable quality. The premium price was not purely a brand premium. A Radio Flyer steel wagon still held 200 pounds. It still lasted 20 years. It still got handed down through siblings and occasionally through generations. Independent testing consistently rated it highest in durability, safety, and construction quality. The story the marketing told was a true story, which is ultimately the only kind that compounds over time. What the Centennial revealed in 2017. Radio Flyer turned 100 years old. The company produced a limited edition wagon for the occasion, replicating the 1933 original down to period-correct wheel hubs and vintage-style decals. Priced at $299. Production was capped at 1,917 units, one for each year since Antonio Payson rented that 600-square-foot workshop on the north side of Chicago. They sold out in 3 months. mostly to adult collectors who had no intention of letting any child near them. The Centennial revealed something that had been true for years, but became impossible to ignore. Once stated clearly, Radio Flyer's customer base had bifurcated completely. Some customers bought wagons for children, valuing quality and durability and the specific joy of watching a small person discover the physics of momentum. Others bought wagons as objects, collectibles, home accessories, symbols of a particular aesthetic sensibility, physical anchors for memories that had nowhere else to live. These two groups had almost nothing in common except the wagon itself. Radio Flyer now serves both, along with a third, the mass-market customer who wants a functional, affordable outdoor toy and doesn't particularly care about heritage or craftsmanship or what the thing represents. This customer can buy a plastic wagon at Target for $49.99. Made in China, decent quality, nothing exceptional. The premium customer can buy a steel wagon at Pottery Barn for $149.99. Made in Chicago, exceptional quality wrapped in heritage. The collector can buy limited editions directly from the company for $299 to $599. Signed and numbered, presented as art objects rather than toys. This portfolio approach is how the company survives. No single product line would sustain it. Together, they create a system where mass-market products generate volume and retail visibility. Premium products generate margin and brand reinforcement. And limited editions generate the cultural cachet that justifies premium pricing for everything else. The factory on West Grand Avenue. The Radio Flyer factory still operates on West Grand Avenue in Chicago, though it occupies a fraction of its former footprint. The sprawling complex that once covered 90,000 square feet and employed 1,200 workers has been condensed to a modern 40-5-1,000 square foot facility with fewer than 200 employees. Smaller by every measure than its peak. Still there. Walk through the factory today and you'll see something Antonio Payson would recognize immediately. Sheet steel arrives from mills in Indiana and Ohio. Still American steel. A fact that appears in the marketing materials and is also simply true. Stamping presses form wagon bodies in two strikes, a rough form and a finish form, exactly as Antonio engineered the process in 1933. The bodies move through washing, priming, and painting. 3 coats of red enamel. The same pigment formulation developed in the 1930s, because it produces the exact shade that 90 years of customer expectation has made the only correct shade. The wooden handles are maple, cut by a supplier in Wisconsin, sanded by hand to remove splinters, fitted with steel reinforcement, attached with a bolt and washer assembly that allows free rotation. Every finished wagon is loaded with 50 pounds and pulled 50 feet before packaging to confirm that the wheels roll smoothly and the body holds its shape. A classic steel wagon, Model 18, direct descendant of Antonio's 1933 design, sells approximately 85,000 units a year at a retail price of $119.99. It generates more contribution margin from less than $10 million in revenue than the company's entire product line generated in 2001. It is made by skilled workers who earn good wages in the same city where Antonio Payson built his first stamping press on borrowed money, sustained by stubbornness and a conviction that the right solution to any problem was to make the product that solved it better than anyone else could be bothered. 2. What my grandfather understood he thought about that garage wagon many times since my grandfather died. He had grown up in a world where a red wagon was simply part of the furniture of childhood, something every yard had. something that accumulated the scratches and paint chips and slightly wobbly wheels of a life actually being lived in it. He hadn't kept it for Antonio Payson's sake, or for Radio Flyer's sake, or for any reason that would have made sense in a business meeting. He kept it because it held something he didn't have another way to hold. That is, in the end, what the company figured out how to sell. Not a product, a vessel, a way to keep something from the past present enough to touch, to oil, to pass down. A physical object that makes the argument quietly, without being asked to, that some things were made to last and did, and are still here. Antonio Payson thought he was building wagons. He was building memory machines, objects that connect generations, that carry the emotional weight of specific summers and specific grandparents and specific versions of childhood, that no longer exist anywhere, except in the people who lived them. Once Radio Flyer understood that distinction, the path forward became clear, even if it was narrower than the path they'd been on. Not every company gets a third act. Not every heritage brand finds a way to make the past genuinely valuable in the present, rather than simply invoking it for marketing purposes. Radio Flyer did, because the people running it were eventually willing to become smaller in order to survive, willing to abandon the democratic promise of the wagon everyone could afford in favor of something more limited and more sustainable, willing to price the product at what it was actually worth to the people who actually valued it. The wagon on West Grand Avenue is still red, still stamped steel, still wooden handle, still $119.99, which is to say it costs what it costs to make. Something that doesn't break in a city where workers earn enough to live on. My grandfather would have paid it. He would have understood exactly what he was getting. The Radio Flyer factory still operates at West Grand Avenue in Chicago. The Model 18, Antonio Payson's 1933 design, essentially unchanged, retails today for $119.99 and is still made in the same city where a 16-year-old boy from Venice arrived with $27 sewn into the lining of his jacket, and an idea about how things ought to be built. Some things, it turns out, you really don't throw away.